Welcome to the complete history of BoJack Horseman, told in a way designed to guide you gently into sleep. Let your mind drift as we explore the life of a horse who became more human than most humans, and the profound tragedy that shaped him. Our story begins not with BoJack himself, but with the generation that created him. In the quiet suburbs of San Francisco during the 1960s, a young socialite named Beatrice Sugarman lived a life of privilege that would soon crumble. Born into wealth, Beatrice experienced a defining trauma at age 10 when her mother, Honey Sugarman, suffered a mental breakdown after losing her son Crackerjack in World War II. Rather than receiving help, Honey was lobotomized by Beatrice's father, Joseph Sugarman, who believed that negative emotions were simply problems to be eliminated. This act of violence, disguised as medicine, would echo through generations. Beatrice learned from her father that feelings were weaknesses, that love was conditional, and that the appearance of perfection mattered more than genuine connection. When she met Butterscotch Horseman, a bitter, failed novelist who blamed the world for his lack of success, she saw an escape from her suffocating family. But escape isn't the same as freedom. Their hasty marriage, triggered by an unwanted pregnancy, became a prison for them both. On January 2nd, 1964, BoJack Horseman was born into a home where he was never wanted. His very existence represented the death of his parents' dreams. Butterscotch saw in his son the embodiment of his failure, the novel he never finished, the literary acclaim he never achieved. Beatrice saw the end of her youth, her figure, and any chance of happiness. From his earliest moments, BoJack learned that his presence was a burden, that love was something other people received, and that he was fundamentally unworthy. The Horseman household in San Francisco was a masterclass in dysfunction. Butterscotch would spend days in his study, typing away at a novel he called brilliant but would never complete, drinking heavily and emerging only to criticize his wife and son. Beatrice, trapped in a life she despised, oscillated between cold indifference and cutting cruelty. She would look at young BoJack and say things like, "You were born broken," words that would calcify in his psyche like concrete. The psychological concept of the internal working model explains how children form templates for relationships based on early experiences. BoJack's template was built on rejection, unpredictability, and the understanding that he was the problem. Throughout his childhood, BoJack developed what psychologists call anxious attachment, a desperate need for approval, combined with the certainty that he would never receive it. He would perform for his parents, trying to make them laugh, trying to earn a kind word or a gentle touch. Sometimes it worked briefly. Sometimes Beatrice would have a moment of softness, or Butterscotch would pat him on the head before retreating back into bitterness. These intermittent reinforcements are actually more powerful than consistent rejection. They teach you to keep trying, to keep performing, to keep hoping that maybe this time you'll finally be enough. School offered no reprieve. BoJack was awkward, too eager, trying too hard to make friends while carrying the weight of his home life. He learned to use humor as a shield, to make people laugh before they could hurt him. This defensive mechanism would become both his greatest asset and his most limiting cage. The class clown routine worked. It got attention. It deflected pain. It created a persona that could be loved, even if the real BoJack couldn't be. As BoJack entered his teenage years, the patterns deepened. Butterscotch's drinking worsened. His verbal abuse intensified. He would tell BoJack that he was stupid, untalented, destined for nothing. Beatrice, worn down by years of resentment, became even more withholding. The concept of learned helplessness applies here. When someone repeatedly experiences uncontrollable negative outcomes. They begin to believe that nothing they do matters. BoJack learned that he couldn't make his parents happy, couldn't earn their love, couldn't change his circumstances. So he learned to numb himself, to lower his expectations, to survive rather than thrive. The suburban San Francisco house was filled with objects that represented broken dreams. Beatrice's debutante photos from before she ruined her life. Butterscotch's typewriter clacking away at pages no one would read. Awards and trophies from generations past that seemed to mock the present family's failures. BoJack would walk through these rooms like a ghost, unseen and unseeable, learning that he was simply something to be endured until he could leave. What's particularly tragic about BoJack's childhood is that both parents occasionally showed glimmers of their better selves. Butterscotch could be charming when he wanted to be, could tell a good story, could almost seem like the successful writer he imagined himself to be. Beatrice had moments of vulnerability where you could see the scared little girl who watched her mother disappear. But these moments were cruel in their rarity. They showed BoJack what could have been, what he almost had, making the usual coldness even more painful by contrast. The psychology of parental narcissism played out in the Horseman home with textbook precision. Both Butterscotch and Beatrice saw BoJack as an extension of themselves rather than a separate person with his own needs. When he succeeded, they took credit. When he failed, they blamed him for embarrassing them. He was never allowed to simply be himself. He existed only in relation to their disappointments and delusions. By the time BoJack left home for college in the early 1980s, his personality was essentially formed. He had learned to perform, to seek validation from strangers, to push away genuine intimacy while desperately craving it. He had learned that he was both the center of blame and utterly insignificant. He had learned to hate himself with the same intensity his parents had modeled. And he had learned that maybe, just maybe, if he could become famous enough, successful enough, loved by enough people, it might finally fill the void that his childhood had carved into his soul. As you drift towards sleep, consider this. BoJack's childhood was not extraordinary in its specifics. Many people grow up in homes where love is conditional, where parents are trapped in their own pain, where children absorb trauma like sponges. What makes BoJack's story powerful is its honesty about how these early wounds never fully heal, how they shape every relationship, every choice, every moment of self-sabotage that follows. His childhood was the blueprint for everything that would come after: the fame, the addiction, the destructive patterns, and yes, the occasional glimmers of growth and hope. Understanding where he came from is essential to understanding why he became who he became. The early 1980s found BoJack Horseman in Los Angeles, ostensibly studying at Wesleyan College, but really just searching for something he couldn't name. Los Angeles in this era was a city of perpetual reinvention, where nobodies could become somebodies, where your past could be whatever story you told most convincingly. For someone fleeing a toxic childhood, it seemed like the perfect place. But you can't outrun your internal landscape, no matter how far you travel. At Wesleyan, BoJack met Herb Kazaz, a comedy nerd with genuine talent and an infectious optimism that stood in stark contrast to BoJack's inherited cynicism. Herb was everything BoJack wasn't: comfortable in his own skin, passionate about his craft, capable of forming real connections. Their friendship was immediate and intense. For the first time in his life, BoJack had someone who seemed to see value in him beyond what he could perform or provide. Herb laughed at BoJack's jokes, yes, but he also listened to his thoughts, challenged his ideas, and treated him like a person worth knowing. This was also where BoJack met Princess Carolyn, a young student who was already showing the driven, competent nature that would define her career, and Charlotte, a kind-hearted woman who would become BoJack's idealized vision of the one who got away. These college relationships represented a possible future, one where BoJack could be genuinely known and still accepted. But that possibility terrified him as much as it attracted him. The psychology of counterdependency was at play here. Having never learned to trust intimacy, BoJack would get close to people and then find ways to maintain distance. With Charlotte, he was interested but never made a real move, keeping her forever in the realm of fantasy where she couldn't actually reject him. This pattern, wanting connection while sabotaging its possibility, would repeat throughout his life like a dark refrain. After college, BoJack and Herb moved in together, trying to break into comedy in an LA that was oversaturated with people who had the same dream. They performed at open mics, wrote sketches that no one would produce, and survived on ramen and ambition. This period, from roughly 1984 to 1987, was perhaps the last time BoJack was genuinely happy, though he probably didn't realize it at the time. He had a best friend, a purpose, and the comforting delusion that success would solve all his internal problems. During this time, BoJack developed his comedic persona more fully. His humor had an edge to it, a darkness that came from real pain but was packaged as irony. Audiences responded to it. There was something authentic in BoJack's performance, even as he was learning to hide his real self more effectively. The paradox of performance, being most honest when you're pretending to be someone else, became BoJack's refuge. Herb, meanwhile, was the creative engine. He wrote constantly, pitched endlessly, and believed with unwavering faith that they would make it. This belief was both inspiring and somewhat burdensome for BoJack, who had learned from his father that dreams were just elaborate setups for disappointment. But Herb's optimism was infectious enough to keep BoJack engaged. Then came the break they'd been waiting for. In 1987, Herb created a show concept called Horsin' Around, a family sitcom about a horse who adopts 3 human children. It was formulaic, sure, but it had heart, and more importantly, it had a place for BoJack in the lead role. This was the moment that would change everything, the moment that seemed to validate all the struggle and waiting. Network executives at ABC saw something in BoJack's audition, a depth, an edge, a sadness beneath the comedy that made the character feel real. But success came with an impossible price. The network, reflecting the casual homophobia of the era, wanted Herb gone when rumors about his sexuality began to circulate. BoJack was faced with a choice: stand by his best friend, the person who had created this opportunity and believed in him when no one else did, or prioritize his own career. The psychological phenomenon of moral licensing explains part of what happened next. People who see themselves as generally good feel they have permission to occasionally act badly. BoJack told himself he deserved this chance, that he'd earned it, that standing up for Herb might cost him everything. So he didn't stand up for Herb. He told himself it was complicated, that there was nothing he could have done, that speaking out wouldn't have changed anything. But the truth was simpler and more damning. When forced to choose between loyalty and self-interest, BoJack chose himself. This betrayal would haunt him for decades, not just because he lost his best friend, but because it proved something he'd always suspected about himself, that he was exactly the selfish, cowardly person his parents had implied he was. The period between Herb's firing in 1987 and the premiere of Horsin' Around in 1987 was a strange limbo. BoJack was on the verge of becoming famous, but he'd already lost something essential. He tried to reach out to Herb a few times, but his apologies were half-hearted, more about alleviating his own guilt than genuine remorse. Herb, understandably, wanted nothing to do with him. BoJack threw himself into preparing for the show. He worked with acting coaches, studied other sitcom stars, and crafted the persona of the horse from Horsin' Around with meticulous care. This persona was charming, self-deprecating, lovable, everything the real BoJack felt he wasn't. The mask was so well constructed that eventually even BoJack would have trouble distinguishing it from his actual self. Princess Carolyn, who had become his manager, saw the potential in BoJack and helped shape his public image. Their relationship was already complicated. Professional respect mixed with personal attraction, mixed with Princess Carolyn's tendency to try to fix broken things. She believed in BoJack's talent, but more than that, she believed she could help him become the person he could be. This savior complex would trap her for years. As 1987 turned to 1988 and the premiere date approached, BoJack stood at a threshold. Behind him was a childhood of neglect and a betrayal that proved he was capable of profound selfishness. Ahead of him was fame, money, and the seductive promise that external validation could heal internal wounds. He didn't know yet that fame would only amplify who he already was, that money couldn't buy self-worth, and that the character he played on TV would become a prison as confining as his parents' house in San Francisco. The tragedy of BoJack's almost success, before the actual success, is that it showed him exactly who he was capable of being when pushed. Not a hero, not loyal, not brave. Just another person willing to sacrifice others for his own advancement, just like his father before him, just like the industry he was entering. The California dream of reinvention was real. But what BoJack was reinventing himself into wasn't necessarily better than what he'd left behind. It was just louder, more visible, and more expensive. Horsin' Around premiered on ABC in 1988 and became an immediate cultural phenomenon. The show about a bachelor horse who adopts 3 human children hit at exactly the right moment. It was wholesome family entertainment, with just enough edge to feel contemporary, comfort food for a nation that wanted simple solutions to complex problems. For 9 seasons, BoJack Horseman was a household name, his face on lunchboxes and posters, his catchphrases repeated by millions. He had achieved everything he thought he wanted, and discovered that achievement was hollow. The show's premise was simple. BoJack's character, also named BoJack, took in 3 orphan children and learned valuable life lessons while raising them. There was Sabrina, the precocious older daughter, Ethan, the middle child with a heart condition that conveniently provided dramatic moments, and Bradley, the adorable youngest, who hit comedic beats with practiced precision. Each episode followed a formula. Problem introduced, hijinks ensued, heartfelt speech delivered, lesson learned, fade to credits. It was predictable, profitable, and creatively suffocating. Behind the scenes, BoJack was discovering that fame doesn't fix you. It just makes your dysfunction more visible and more enabled. The attention he'd craved his entire life was now constant and overwhelming. Fans approached him everywhere, not seeing BoJack Horseman, but rather the horse from Horsin' Around, a character who was infinitely more patient, kind, and whole than the real person. This distinction between the beloved character and the broken actor would become a chasm that defined his existence. The cast became a strange kind of family, as dysfunctional as any real family, but bound together by the machinery of production. Sarah Lynn, who played Sabrina starting at age 3, was already being moulded into a child star with all the trauma that entailed. Her mother was a classic stage parent, seeing Sarah Lynn as a meal ticket and a path to vicarious fame. BoJack watched this happening, recognized the parallels to his own exploitation by his parents, and did nothing to protect her. This passivity, this failure to interrupt the cycle of abuse, even as he witnessed it, was another brick in the wall of his self-loathing. The show's creator and writers crafted storylines that were increasingly saccharine and divorced from any real emotional truth. BoJack would read scripts where his character delivered speeches about responsibility, integrity, and love, virtues he didn't possess and lessons he hadn't learned. The irony was not lost on him. Every episode was a reminder that he was a fraud, playing a better version of a person at the exact thing, being decent, that he failed at in real life. Bradley Hitler Smith, the youngest cast member, hero-worshipped BoJack in a way that was both flattering and disturbing. Bradley saw BoJack as the cool older brother figure from the show, not understanding that the real BoJack was often drunk, depressed, and barely holding it together. This hero worship would end badly decades later, but in the 90s, it just added to BoJack's guilt, another person he was letting down simply by being himself. Fame brought other complications. BoJack's relationship with Princess Carolyn evolved from professional to romantic, a catastrophic mixing of boundaries that suited both their neuroses. Princess Carolyn was attracted to the project of BoJack, the potential she saw in him, the belief that her competence could compensate for his chaos. BoJack was attracted to her unwavering support, the way she managed his life so he didn't have to be a functional adult. They would break up and get back together in cycles that matched BoJack's cycles of self-destruction and brief attempts at growth. The money from horsing around was substantial. BoJack was making hundreds of thousands per episode by the end of the run. He bought a house in the Hollywood Hills, the same house where he would still be living decades later, filling it with awards and memorabilia that represented his peak. The house became a museum to his past success and a monument to his inability to move forward. Every room was decorated in late 80s, early 90s style, frozen in time like BoJack himself would be. During these years, BoJack developed his substance abuse patterns more fully. Alcohol was already a constant companion, inherited from his father's example, but he added prescription pills, party drugs, anything that could blunt the cognitive dissonance between his public success and private misery. The entertainment industry enabled this completely. Being difficult, being high, being destructive were all tolerated as long as you showed up and hit your marks. The psychological concept of hedonic adaptation explains what happened to BoJack during these peak years. Humans quickly adjust to new circumstances, returning to a baseline level of happiness, regardless of external changes. BoJack had thought fame would make him happy, but within months it became his new normal, and his underlying depression and self-loathing returned. The thrill of recognition faded, the money became expected, and he was left with the same internal emptiness he'd always had, now just dressed in nicer clothes. Socially, BoJack was surrounded by people, but profoundly isolated. Hollywood parties were full of acquaintances, networking, and superficial connections. Everyone wanted something from him. His fame, his money, his connections. Genuine friendship, the kind he'd briefly had with Herb, seemed impossible. He would oscillate between grandiosity, believing his own hype, treating people as beneath him, and self-loathing crashes where he knew he was a fraud who'd betrayed his best friend for this hollow existence. The show's writing deteriorated over the years, as networks demanded increasingly broad humor and more teachable moments. By the final seasons, BoJack was phoning it in, drinking between takes, and openly showing contempt for the material. But the audience didn't care. They loved the character regardless, proving that you don't have to be good at something to be rewarded for it. You just have to be famous for doing it. When Horsin' Around was finally cancelled in 1996, after 9 seasons, it should have felt like liberation. Instead, it felt like abandonment. BoJack had spent nearly a decade being the horse from Horsin' Around, and now he didn't know who he was supposed to be. The show had been a prison, yes, but it was a familiar prison with clear routines and expectations. Freedom was terrifying because it required him to actually decide what kind of person he wanted to become, and BoJack had never developed that capacity for self-direction. The final episode of Horsin' Around featured BoJack's character giving a speech to the now grown children about how proud he was of them, how raising them had made him a better person. It was pure fiction, on the show and in reality. BoJack had watched 3 child actors grow up, had contributed to at least one severe psychological damage, and had learned nothing about responsibility or growth. The standing ovation from the studio audience felt like mockery. They were applauding a lie, loving a person who didn't exist, and BoJack knew it with devastating clarity. After Horsin' Around ended in 1996, BoJack entered what Hollywood euphemistically calls a transitional period, but what was really a slow-motion collapse. He was 32 years old, wealthy, famous for something that had ended, and completely unprepared for the question, what next? The 90s stretched into the 2000s, and each year BoJack became less relevant, less hireable, and more of a cautionary tale about child stars and has-beens. Ironic, since he was neither. The first few years post Horsin' Around, BoJack tried to reinvent himself. He fired Princess Carolyn as his manager in one of their breakups, only to rehire her weeks later when he realized she was the only person who could tolerate managing his career and his dysfunction. She pitched him for dramatic roles, trying to help him shed the sitcom star image, but casting directors couldn't see past the horse from Horsin' Around. Or maybe they could see past it and didn't like what they found. A difficult, unprepared actor whose main skill was hitting his mark in a 3-camera sitcom. There were auditions that went nowhere. BoJack would show up late, sometimes drunk, often unprepared, and wonder why he wasn't getting callbacks. He was used to coasting on charm and name recognition, but those currencies depreciated rapidly in an industry that constantly sought the new. The psychological defense mechanism of external attribution was in full effect. BoJack blamed Hollywood's shallowness, the industry's ageism, bad luck, anything except his own behavior and lack of professional development. In 1998, he took a role in a poorly conceived spin-off called The BoJack Horseman Show, which ABC hoped would recapture the magic of Horsin' Around. It was basically the same concept, BoJack adopting kids, but without any of what had accidentally worked about the original. The show was retooled halfway through the first season, desperately trying to find an audience, and was cancelled after a handful of episodes. This failure was public and humiliating in a way the cancellation of Horsin' Around hadn't been. That had been a successful show, ending its natural run. This was proof that BoJack Horseman couldn't carry a show anymore. The early 2000s were a blur of bad decisions and missed opportunities. BoJack turned down roles he later regretted refusing, convinced they were beneath him. He accepted roles in terrible projects that seemed promising, a recurring part on a Law and Order knockoff, a guest spot on a reality show, voice work in animated films where he was clearly phoning it in. Nothing stuck. His IMDb page became a graveyard of unmemorable appearances and projects that never materialized. Financially, BoJack was still comfortable. The residuals from horsing around provided a steady income, and he'd invested well enough, or rather, Princess Carolyn had invested for him, that he wasn't in danger of going broke. But money without purpose is just a way to fund your self-destruction more comfortably. BoJack's days developed a depressing routine. Wake up late, day drink, watch old episodes of his show, ignore calls from Princess Carolyn, hook up with strangers who recognized him from TV, pass out, repeat. His house in the Hollywood Hills became both his sanctuary and his prison. He stopped maintaining it, stopped cleaning, stopped caring. Empty bottles accumulated, the pool grew algae, and the walls remained decorated with memorabilia from a career that had peaked 20 years earlier. Visitors were rare. Princess Carolyn on business, occasional women who left quickly, delivery people who handed over food and alcohol without making eye contact. Relationship-wise, these were the years of maximum damage. BoJack cycled through brief affairs with increasing nihilism, treating people as disposable because treating them as real would require vulnerability he couldn't access. Princess Carolyn remained in his orbit, managing his career even when they weren't romantically involved, demonstrating a codependency that was unhealthy for both of them. She enabled his worst behaviors while trying to save him from himself, a contradiction that trapped her in an endless loop of hope and disappointment. Around 2007, BoJack reconnected briefly with an old friend from his horsing around days and made a disastrous visit to Herb Kazaz. Herb had been living in Malibu, had built a successful career directing niche shows after being fired from horsing around, and had clearly processed the betrayal in ways BoJack hadn't. The meeting was devastating. BoJack wanted forgiveness, wanted to be told that their friendship still mattered, wanted to be released from guilt without having to do the actual work of genuine remorse. Herb refused to give him that comfort, instead delivering a speech that cut to the truth. BoJack had chosen to believe he couldn't have fought for Herb because accepting that he could have but didn't would mean accepting his own cowardice. This confrontation should have been a catalyst for change. Instead, it sent BoJack into a deeper spiral. If Herb couldn't forgive him, if redemption wasn't possible, then what was the point of trying? This logic, using the difficulty of growth as an excuse to not grow, became BoJack's default mode. He was trapped in what psychologists call experiential avoidance, systematically avoiding any thoughts, feelings, or situations that caused discomfort, which meant avoiding basically everything that could lead to actual change. The 2000s also saw changes in the culture that left BoJack behind. The rise of prestige television created a new class of TV stars who were taken seriously as actors. Reality TV became dominant, making traditional sitcoms seem quaint. Streaming services began to emerge, fragmenting audiences and making the kind of universal fame BoJack had experienced increasingly rare. He was becoming an anachronism, a relic from a different era of television, and he knew it. By 2014, BoJack was 50 years old and hadn't worked on anything meaningful in nearly 2 decades. He'd been living off past success for so long that the past started to feel more real than the present. His days were indistinguishable from each other, his house was a time capsule, and his personality had calcified into the worst versions of all his tendencies. Narcissistic, self-pitying, cruel when drunk, desperate when sober enough to notice his own emptiness. This was when he approached Princess Carolyn, with what seemed like a last-ditch attempt at relevance. What if he wrote a memoir, not a ghost-written celebrity puff piece, but an honest, raw account of his life and career? It could be his way back into the cultural conversation, his way of controlling his own narrative, his way of mattering again. Princess Carolyn, ever hopeful that this time BoJack might actually follow through on something, agreed to try to find him a ghostwriter. The Wilderness Years, from 1996 to 2014, represented almost 2 decades of stagnation dressed up as lifestyle. BoJack had everything he'd thought he wanted from fame: money, recognition, comfort, freedom from the family that had damaged him. But he'd learned the hard lesson that external circumstances can't fix internal wounds. Without purpose, without growth, without genuine connection, even a comfortable life becomes a slow-motion suicide. As 2014 began, and a ghostwriter named Diane Nguyen prepared to move into his house to write his story, BoJack was about to discover that confronting your past honestly might be even more painful than running from it. The year 2014 marked a turning point in BoJack Horseman's life. Though like most turning points, it would take years to understand its significance. When Diane Nguyen arrived at his door, a serious, principled journalist tasked with ghostwriting his memoir, BoJack expected to charm her into writing a flattering version of his life story. What he got instead was someone who would hold up a mirror and refuse to let him look away. Diane Nguyen represented everything BoJack claimed to value, but actually found threatening: honesty, integrity, and the courage to say uncomfortable truths. She'd been hired by Princess Carolyn and the publishing house Pinafore to write One Trick Pony, the BoJack Horseman story, and she approached the project with journalistic rigor. She conducted interviews with people from BoJack's past, researched his career thoroughly, and most disturbingly, actually listened when BoJack talked, hearing not just the stories he told, but the patterns underneath them. In the beginning, BoJack fell into his usual pattern with women: light flirtation, emotional intimacy at a safe distance, the dance of getting close without actually being vulnerable. But Diane was engaged to Mr. Peanut Butter, a yellow Labrador retriever who had been BoJack's professional rival since Mr. Peanut Butter's show, Mr. Peanut Butter's House, had premiered opposite Horsin' Around in the 90s. The shows had been in direct competition, and while both were successful, Mr. Peanut Butter's endless optimism and genuine likability had always been an implicit criticism of BoJack's darker persona. Mr. Peanut Butter's presence in the story introduces a crucial contrast. Where BoJack was nihilistic and self-absorbed, Mr. Peanut Butter was optimistic and people-pleasing. Where BoJack wallowed in past glories and resentments, Mr. Peanut Butter lived entirely in the present moment. They were mirror images of how to handle fame and life. Mr. Peanut Butter chose to believe everything was great until proven otherwise, while BoJack chose to believe everything was terrible, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Neither approach was exactly healthy, but one was certainly more pleasant to be around. As Diane spent weeks living in BoJack's house, interviewing him daily, she began to piece together not just the facts of his life, but the psychological architecture of his personality. She understood that his narcissism was defensive, that his cruelty came from fear, that his self-sabotage was a way of maintaining control. If you destroy your chances before they have a chance to fail naturally, you never have to risk hoping. This understanding made Diane simultaneously empathetic and unwilling to excuse his behavior. She could see why BoJack was the way he was, but she refused to accept that understanding absolved him of responsibility. During this period, Princess Carolyn was dealing with her own crisis. She'd finally ended her romantic relationship with BoJack for good, or so she thought, but remained his manager because she'd built her identity around saving him, around believing that her competence could compensate for his chaos. Princess Carolyn's story arc introduces questions about codependency and the cost of making someone else's potential your life's work. She was brilliant at her job, tireless, loyal to a fault, and trapped in a pattern where she enabled BoJack's dysfunction while simultaneously trying to save him from it. The memoir project forced BoJack to confront specific moments from his past. Diane wanted to include his betrayal of Herb Kazaz, his failure to protect Sarah Lynn, his pattern of burning through relationships and opportunities. BoJack wanted a redemption narrative where his mistakes were understandable setbacks on a journey toward growth. The tension between these two visions, honest accounting versus self-justifying mythology, became the central conflict of their working relationship. Then came a crucial moment. Diane and Mr. Peanut Butter invited BoJack to their engagement party. At this party, surrounded by Mr. Peanut Butter's friends, who all seemed to genuinely like each other, BoJack felt his jealousy and self-pity intensify. Later that night, Diane came to BoJack's house, upset because she'd fought with Mr. Peanut Butter about something trivial, and BoJack saw an opportunity. He kissed her, a moment of profound selfishness, where he prioritized his own desires over her relationship, her clarity, and their working relationship. Diane rejected him, of course, and the next day told BoJack with devastating clarity that she didn't think he was a bad person. She just thought he was a person who did bad things, and that was somehow worse because it meant he knew better but chose otherwise. This distinction between being bad and choosing to do bad would haunt BoJack because it removed the excuse of inevitability. If he was just a bad person, his behavior was fixed, determined. But if he was someone who chose badly, that meant change was possible, which meant every continued bad choice was a deliberate decision. The memoir, when Diane finally finished it, was honest in ways BoJack had never authorized and could barely tolerate. She'd written not a puff piece, but a psychological portrait of someone trapped by childhood trauma, fame's false promises, and his own refusal to grow. The publishing house rejected it for being too dark, too honest, too much of a bummer for the light celebrity memoir they'd commissioned. This rejection should have pleased BoJack. It meant his failures wouldn't be public, but instead it felt like another way he'd failed, another thing he'd ruined by being too much himself. Around this same time, BoJack received shocking news. Herb Kazaz was dying of cancer. Despite their traumatic last meeting, despite knowing Herb hated him, BoJack felt compelled to visit, driven by the magical thinking that maybe on his deathbed, Herb would grant the forgiveness BoJack desperately needed. The visit to Herb's house was arranged, awkward, and ultimately devastating. Herb was surrounded by friends, people who clearly loved him, people he'd built relationships with in the decades since horsing around. He was dying but seemed more alive and connected than BoJack had ever been. When BoJack finally asked for forgiveness, Herb's refusal was absolute and articulate. He explained that he wasn't obligated to make BoJack feel better about being a bad friend. The narcissism of seeking forgiveness, making even your amends about your own comfort, was laid bare. Herb died shortly after, taking any possibility of reconciliation with him. BoJack handled this loss the only way he knew how, with alcohol, self-pity, and a bender that lasted days. He missed the funeral, couldn't face the other people from horsing around, couldn't tolerate seeing the community Herb had built without him. This avoidance was cowardice, dressed up as pain, and BoJack knew it, even as he chose it. The Diane situation resolved in a way that became typical of BoJack's relationships. She forgave him for the kiss, maintained appropriate boundaries, and refused to let him twist her compassion into enabling. She married Mr. Peanut Butter, despite her doubts, her own form of avoidance, choosing a relationship that was easy and pleasant over one that challenged her. But she and BoJack developed a genuine friendship, one based on understanding rather than romance, on honesty rather than performance. By the end of this period, BoJack had a finished memoir that no one would publish in its honest form, had lost Herb forever without reconciliation, had damaged his relationship with Diane before it could become whatever it might have been, and was no closer to actual change than he'd been before. But something had shifted microscopically. He'd been seen, truly seen, by someone who didn't look away or make excuses. Diane had held up a mirror, and while BoJack didn't like the reflection, at least it was accurate. That honesty, as painful as it was, represented a tiny seed of possibility. The possibility that knowing yourself accurately was the prerequisite for becoming someone better. Whether BoJack would nurture that seed or poison it with alcohol and avoidance remained to be seen. After Herb's death and the rejection of Diane's honest memoir, BoJack found himself in a familiar emotional space, desperate for redemption, but unwilling to do the actual work it required. Then Princess Carolyn called with news that seemed like salvation itself. He'd been offered the lead role in a prestige biopic about Secretariat, the legendary racehorse who'd won the Triple Crown in 1973. This wasn't just any role, it was serious, Oscar-worthy, exactly the kind of project that could transform him from horsing around, into a capital A actor. Secretariat had been BoJack's childhood hero. In the toxic wasteland of his youth, when Butterscotch was drunk and Beatrice was cruel, young BoJack would watch Secretariat race on television and see something transcendent, an image of pure will, of refusing to quit, of running so fast and so far that maybe you could escape whatever was chasing you. The 1973 Belmont Stakes, where Secretariat won by 31 lengths, was BoJack's most treasured memory, the one moment of beauty in an otherwise bleak childhood. The opportunity to play his hero felt cosmically significant to BoJack. He convinced himself that this role would be his redemption, that great art could somehow compensate for bad behavior, that if he could just nail this performance, it would prove he was more than a washed-up sitcom star, more than a collection of bad decisions. This is the seductive lie of artistic redemption, the belief that creating something beautiful can erase the ugliness of how you live. Preparation for the role consumed BoJack. He read everything about Secretariat, studied race footage until his eyes hurt, worked with dialect coaches and movement specialists. For the first time in decades, he was genuinely trying at something, investing real effort rather than coasting on charm and past success. Princess Carolyn watched this transformation with cautious hope. Maybe this would be the thing that finally changed him. Maybe taking his career seriously would lead to taking his life seriously. But as production began, complications emerged. The director, Kelsey Jennings, was a talented woman who'd made her name directing edgy, independent films. She had a vision for the Secretariat movie that was darker and more complex than the studio wanted. She saw Secretariat not just as an inspirational sports story, but as a meditation on pressure, expectation, and the cost of greatness. This vision resonated with BoJack because it matched his own tendency toward darkness, but it put Kelsey at odds with the producers who wanted a feel-good crowd pleaser. During filming, BoJack and Kelsey developed a genuine working relationship built on mutual respect, a rarity in BoJack's life. She pushed him as an actor, demanded more from him than he'd given in decades, and refused to let him hide behind his usual tricks. Under her direction, BoJack was actually good. The dailies showed a performance with real depth, vulnerability without sentimentality, the kind of work that could genuinely transform a career. There was a specific scene Kelsey wanted to shoot at the Griffith Park Observatory, a dream sequence where Secretariat speaks to his younger self. It was metaphorical, artistically ambitious, and completely contrary to what the studio had approved. Kelsey asked BoJack to help her shoot it guerrilla style, off the books, believing it was essential to the film's emotional core. This was BoJack's chance to do what he'd failed to do with Herb decades earlier: stand up for an artist's vision, prioritize art over commerce, be brave when it mattered. And BoJack said yes. They shot the scene, and it was beautiful. Exactly the kind of moment that makes films transcendent rather than merely good. For a brief window, BoJack felt what it was like to be part of creating something real, to stand with someone rather than protecting himself. But when the studio found out about the unauthorized shoot, they fired Kelsey immediately. And once again, BoJack was given a choice: speak up for the director who'd believed in him, or protect his own position in the film. Once again, BoJack chose silence. He told himself the same stories, that speaking up wouldn't have changed anything, that his career was at stake, that he'd tried, and that was enough. Kelsey was escorted off the lot, the scene was cut from the film, and BoJack kept his job. The parallel to the Herb situation was so obvious it was almost parodic. When forced to choose between loyalty and self-interest, BoJack would always choose himself. Then he would spend months, years, decades hating himself for that choice while never actually changing the pattern. The psychological mechanism at play here is what's called instrumental learning. We repeat behaviors that have been rewarded and avoid behaviors that have been punished. BoJack had been rewarded for choosing himself over others. He'd gotten famous with horsing around. He'd kept his role in the Secretariat movie. The immediate rewards of selfishness consistently outweighed the delayed costs of guilt and self-loathing. So the pattern persisted, despite his conscious awareness that it was wrong. The Secretariat movie continued production with a replacement director who executed the studio's safe, conventional vision. BoJack's performance was still good. His preparation couldn't be entirely undone, but the film lost whatever spark of genuine artistry it might have had. It became exactly what the studio wanted: competent, polished, forgettable. During post-production, BoJack watched as his potentially great performance was edited into something merely adequate. A waste of effort that matched the waste of opportunity. Around this same time, Todd Chavez was still living in BoJack's house. Todd had moved in years earlier and never left, a pattern enabled by BoJack's loneliness and Todd's own directionless life. Their relationship was strange, not quite friends, not quite family, something more like mutual emotional support animals. Todd was the only person who lived with BoJack's day-to-day dysfunction and somehow maintained affection for him. But this affection was being tested. Todd had dreams, vague and unfocused as they were. He wanted to do something with his life, create something, matter somehow. BoJack, in his narcissism and fear of abandonment, consistently sabotaged these efforts. When Todd had a chance to go on tour with his rock opera, yes, Todd had somehow written a rock opera, BoJack sabotaged it through a series of manipulations that he told himself were accidents. This betrayal was quieter than the Herb or Kelsey situations, but it was another brick in the same wall. BoJack couldn't stand by people who trusted him. The pattern was becoming crystalline. BoJack surrounded himself with people who believed in him or needed him. Princess Carolyn, Todd, the cast of Horsin around Kelsey, and then systematically betrayed or disappointed each of them, not through dramatic villainy, but through 1,000 small choices to prioritize his comfort, his career, his pain over theirs. He was a black hole of need, disguised as a person, pulling people into orbit and then wondering why they eventually fled or crashed. As the Secretariat movie approached its release date, BoJack oscillated between fantasies of Oscar glory and certainty of failure. The movie was fine. Critics would probably call it workmanlike or competent, and his performance was the best part of it. But best part of a mediocre movie doesn't win Oscars. The redemption he'd imagined, the transformation from sitcom star to serious actor, wasn't going to happen. Art hadn't saved him because art can't save you when you keep undermining the people who create it. The psychology of approach avoidance conflict explains BoJack's relationship to success. He desperately wanted recognition, validation, proof that he mattered, but he also feared it because success would make him visible, vulnerable to criticism, exposed as the fraud he believed himself to be. So he would approach success, working hard on Secretariat, trying to be good, but then sabotage it through behaviors that ensured failure, allowing him to maintain his comfortable narrative that the world wouldn't let him succeed, rather than facing the scarier truth that he wouldn't let himself succeed. The Secretariat experience left BoJack exactly where he'd started. Talented enough to have opportunities, self-destructive enough to waste them, self-aware enough to hate himself for the pattern, and avoidant enough to never break it. The movie that was supposed to redeem him became just another entry in a long list of almosts and what-ifs. And, worst of all, he'd proven once again that when it mattered, he would choose wrong, betray the people who believed in him, and then spend years wallowing in guilt without ever actually learning or changing. The Secretariat role was BoJack's best chance at the kind of redemption he claimed to want, and he'd sabotaged it through the same patterns that had defined his life. If he couldn't change when everything was at stake, when would he ever change? This question hung over him as the movie wrapped, a question he didn't want to answer, because the answer might be never. As the Secretariat movie finished post-production and the long wait for its release began, BoJack found himself in a familiar state of restless dissatisfaction. The project that was supposed to save him had come and gone, leaving him no more redeemed than before. He'd betrayed another person who believed in him, wasted another opportunity, and confirmed every terrible thing he suspected about himself. He needed an escape, and escape came in the form of an impulsive road trip. BoJack remembered Charlotte, the girl from college he'd never made a move on, the one who got away, the perfect fantasy of what if. He'd learned she was living in New Mexico, married with kids, apparently happy. In a moment of desperation and magical thinking, BoJack decided to drive there. Maybe Charlotte would represent a path not taken, a parallel life where he'd made better choices. Maybe she would save him from himself. Maybe she would prove that he was capable of genuine connection if only he'd found the right person. This kind of thinking, that another person can fix your internal problems, that geography can erase personality, that a fantasy from 30 years ago can be more real than present reality, is a hallmark of what psychologists call external locus of control. BoJack believed his unhappiness was caused by external circumstances, rather than internal patterns, which meant he kept trying to change circumstances while keeping his patterns intact. The drive to New Mexico was impulsive. BoJack didn't tell anyone where he was going, just got in his car and drove, the way people in movies make grand romantic gestures. But this wasn't a movie, and grand gestures don't work when your character hasn't changed. Along the way, through a series of circumstances too complicated to detail during this restful retelling, he ended up bringing someone with him, Charlotte's teenage daughter, Penny. Penny had been a child the last time Charlotte and BoJack had seen each other, and now she was 17, about to go to college, standing at the threshold of adulthood. When BoJack arrived in New Mexico and saw Charlotte's family, the husband she loved, the children she was raising, the life she'd built, it was immediately clear that his fantasy had been exactly that. Charlotte had moved on decades ago. She was happy, genuinely happy, in a way that had nothing to do with BoJack. But BoJack stayed anyway, imposing himself on the family's hospitality, telling himself he just needed a few days to clear his head. He bonded with Charlotte's family, especially Penny, becoming a cool older friend, sharing his Hollywood stories, being charming and fun in that way he could be when he wanted to impress people. For a moment, he convinced himself he could be part of this wholesome family life, that proximity to Charlotte's happiness could make him happy too. Then came prom night. Through a series of events involving Penny and her friends, BoJack ended up being the adult who took these teenagers to prom, who bought them alcohol, who enabled their bad decisions, while telling himself he was being the cool adult rather than the responsible one. This should have been a warning sign, this desire to be liked by teenagers rather than to protect them. But BoJack ignored it. After prom, Penny's friend Maddie got dangerously drunk. BoJack had to rush her to the hospital, where Charlotte met them, furious and frightened. This was the moment Charlotte finally saw through BoJack's charm to the self-centered person underneath. She told him clearly to leave, to go home, to stop imposing his dysfunction on her family. And BoJack agreed, said he would leave in the morning, accepted that his fantasy was over. But that night, Penny came to BoJack's room. She was 17, confused, attracted to this older man who'd been charming and attentive, dealing with her own teenage feelings in ways she didn't fully understand. And BoJack, drunk and desperate and completely aware of how wrong this was, didn't immediately shut it down. He hesitated. He considered it. Charlotte walked in before anything physical happened, but the intent was there, the willingness to cross a line that should have been uncrossable. This moment, BoJack nearly sleeping with his old friend's 17-year-old daughter, represents the nadir of his moral collapse. It wasn't a mistake or an accident. He knew exactly what he was doing and how wrong it was. The psychology here isn't complex. BoJack was so desperate for validation, so empty of genuine self-worth, so accustomed to taking what he wanted regardless of consequences, that he was willing to potentially traumatize a teenager to fill the void in himself for a moment. Charlotte's reaction was immediate and absolute. She threw BoJack out, told him that if he ever tried to contact her or her family again, she would kill him, and made clear that he was exactly the person she'd always feared he might become. There was no forgiveness, no understanding, no possibility of redemption. BoJack had revealed himself completely, and what Charlotte saw was someone so selfish and broken that he would endanger her child to ease his own pain. The drive back to Los Angeles was silent and devastating. BoJack couldn't even formulate excuses to himself. He couldn't blame alcohol, though he'd been drinking. He couldn't blame Charlotte for leading him on. She'd been nothing but clear about her boundaries. He couldn't blame Penny for coming on to him. She was a child, and he was the adult responsible for saying no. For once, there was no narrative that let him off the hook. He'd simply revealed himself as capable of the unforgivable. The New Mexico incident introduced a new element to BoJack's self-loathing. The awareness that he wasn't just hurting himself or wasting opportunities, but actively capable of damaging other people, especially vulnerable people, especially children. Sarah Lynn, who he'd watched being destroyed by Hollywood as a child star and done nothing to protect, was one pattern. Penny was another. BoJack was replicating the cycle of adults failing children that he'd experienced himself, becoming the kind of person he'd needed protection from. When BoJack returned home, he didn't tell anyone what had happened. He buried it, locked it away, tried to pretend it hadn't occurred. But the knowledge sat in him like poison. Every time he looked in the mirror, every time someone treated him with kindness or respect, he knew he was a fraud, hiding something unforgivable. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. The gap between how people saw him and who he actually was had never been wider. Princess Carolyn noticed something was wrong, but couldn't get BoJack to talk about it. Diane sensed his increased darkness, but was dealing with her own struggles in her marriage to Mr. Peanut Butter. Todd was still living in BoJack's house, still being a supportive presence, still unaware that BoJack had recently sabotaged his rock opera tour. Everyone in BoJack's life was treating him better than he deserved, and he knew it with crystalline clarity. The psychological concept of moral injury applies to what BoJack experienced after New Mexico. Moral injury occurs when someone violates their own deeply held moral beliefs or witnesses others doing so, resulting in profound shame, guilt, and damage to one's sense of self. BoJack had always known he was capable of selfishness, laziness, cruelty, but he'd maintained some baseline assumption that there were lines he wouldn't cross. New Mexico proved there weren't, that given the right combination of desperation and opportunity, he would cross any line. This realization could have been a catalyst for change. Hitting bottom often is. But BoJack's response was to simply hate himself more while changing nothing. He increased his drinking, isolated himself further, and let the guilt fester without using it as motivation for growth. This is the trap of shame without accountability. It feels like punishment, like you're being hard on yourself, but it's actually just another form of self-indulgence, another way of making everything about your feelings rather than the harm you've caused others. Penny, back in New Mexico, was left to process what had happened with minimal support. Her mother couldn't explain the full situation without revealing details that would be even more damaging. Penny knew something had gone terribly wrong, but couldn't fully articulate what or why. This ambiguity, this sense that something bad almost happened, but she wasn't sure what, was its own form of trauma. BoJack had managed to harm her, even in his failure to actually sleep with her. The intent, the willingness, the moment of vulnerability exploited, all of it left scars. The New Mexico incident became BoJack's darkest secret, the thing he most feared being revealed, the proof that he was as bad as he'd always suspected. And, like most secrets, it gained power from being hidden, festering in darkness, distorting his relationship with everyone because he couldn't be fully honest with anyone. He'd crossed a line, and there was no uncrossing it, no redemption that could erase it, no amount of good behavior that could balance the scales. He simply had to live with being someone who'd done that thing, and living with it was unbearable. The Secretariat movie was released in 2016 to mixed reviews and modest box office success. BoJack's performance was praised as his best work in decades, but the film itself was deemed forgettable, and the Oscar buzz that Princess Carolyn had hoped for never materialized. BoJack watched his chance at redemption through artistry slip away, proving once again that great work couldn't erase bad behavior, that you couldn't perform your way out of being yourself. But something else was happening in parallel. Sarah Lynn was spiraling. Sarah Lynn, who'd played Sabrina on Horsin' Around from age 3 to 12, had lived the predictable trajectory of child stars. Early success, teenage rebellion, pop star phase, then a slow collapse into addiction and public meltdowns. The girl who'd been exploited by her stage mother, worked to exhaustion, denied a normal childhood, was now a woman drowning in the consequences of fame she'd never chosen. BoJack had watched Sarah Lynn's deterioration for years, with a mix of concern and avoidance. He felt guilty about his role in her childhood. He'd been the adult on set. He'd seen her mother's exploitation. He'd done nothing to intervene. But he told himself that he wasn't responsible, that he'd been dealing with his own problems, that someone else should have protected her. This rationalization was thin enough to see through, and BoJack knew it, but he clung to it anyway. Sarah Lynn had a complicated relationship with BoJack. She saw him as a father figure, the closest thing to a stable adult in her chaotic childhood, but she also resented him for his passivity, for watching her be destroyed and doing nothing. Their relationship in adulthood was dysfunctional and enabling. Sarah Lynn would call BoJack when she was high or depressed, and BoJack would either ignore her or engage in ways that made things worse. They were mutual triggers, reminding each other of their shared past and wasted potential. After the Secretariat premiere, after the realization that his Oscar dreams were dead, BoJack was in a dark place, darker than usual because New Mexico was still eating at him, because he'd failed with the movie, because nothing he tried seemed to make him better. In this state, Sarah Lynn called. She'd been sober for months, was actually doing well, had clarity and hope for maybe the first time in her adult life. And BoJack, in his selfishness and desperation, asked if she wanted to go on a bender. This question, do you want to go on a bender, asked to someone in recovery, asked by someone who knew better, was an act of profound selfishness. BoJack didn't want to drink alone with his guilt. He wanted company in his destruction, someone who would validate his nihilism, someone who would make him feel less alone in his awfulness. And Sarah Lynn, who'd spent her entire life trying to please father figures who disappointed her, said yes. What followed was a multi-day bender through Los Angeles. Drugs, alcohol, planetariums, parties, a blur of intoxication designed to obliterate consciousness. Sarah Lynn and BoJack enabled each other's worst impulses, laughing at the darkness, performing nihilism like it was sophisticated rather than sad. They broke into their old Horseman Around set, taking drugs on the soundstage where Sarah Lynn had spent her childhood, a perfect metaphor for how they were trapped in the past while destroying any possibility of a future. The psychological concept of trauma bonding explains part of their dynamic. They were connected by shared trauma, child stardom, exploitation, fame's hollow promises, and this connection felt deeper than healthy relationships because it was rooted in mutual damage. But trauma bonding isn't actual intimacy. It's just two broken people reflecting each other's pain back and forth, amplifying rather than healing. Sarah Lynn talked during the bender about wanting to be an architect, about having dreams beyond entertainment, about maybe starting over. BoJack listened but didn't really hear, too wrapped in his own numbness to recognize these words as a cry for help. She talked about her childhood, about how playing Sabrina had stolen her actual childhood, about how she'd never gotten to be a kid, and BoJack nodded and passed her another drink, complicit in her destruction because he needed someone to be destructive with. They ended up at the planetarium. Sarah Lynn loved planetariums because they made her feel small, made her problems feel insignificant against the vastness of space. It was a kind of nihilistic comfort, the idea that nothing mattered because everything was so impossibly vast. They lay on the floor of the planetarium, high on everything they'd consumed over the past days, watching stars projected on the ceiling, and Sarah Lynn talked about wanting to see more of the universe, wanting to be more than what Hollywood had made her. Then Sarah Lynn said she wanted to see a real planetarium, not just a projection, and suggested they drive to one outside the city. BoJack, deep in his own high, agreed. But when they got to the car, Sarah Lynn was too intoxicated to function properly. BoJack, also severely impaired, should have stopped everything, called for help, taken her to the hospital. Instead, he took her back to his house to sleep it off, a decision that prioritized his convenience and cowardice over her safety. Back at BoJack's house, Sarah Lynn overdosed. The exact timeline would later become important. She overdosed, and BoJack waited 17 minutes before calling 911. During those 17 minutes, he panicked. He considered his own legal liability. He thought about his career and reputation. He worried about being associated with another dead child star. Only after those 17 minutes, when it was too late, did he finally call for help. Sarah Lynn died at age 31 from a drug overdose in BoJack Horseman's house. The official story was that she'd relapsed, that it was tragic but not unexpected given her history. But the truth was more complex and more damning. BoJack had pulled her off sobriety for his own needs, had enabled her worst impulses for days, and had delayed getting her help because he was more concerned with protecting himself than saving her. The aftermath was devastating. BoJack was questioned by police but not charged. His waiting to cool was suspicious but not quite criminal, and he lied about the timeline anyway. Sarah Lynn's mother, the stage parent who'd exploited her daughter for years, gave emotional interviews about her loss, suddenly playing the grieving mother after years of treating Sarah Lynn as a commodity. The hypocrisy was grotesque, but it was also convenient. It allowed everyone to blame Sarah Lynn's demons rather than examining the industry and individuals who'd created those demons. BoJack's guilt after Sarah Lynn's death was different from his other guilts. With Herb, with Kelsey, with Penny, he'd betrayed people, but they'd survived. Sarah Lynn was dead, and he'd killed her as surely as if he'd forced the drugs into her system himself. He hadn't just failed to save her, he'd actively pulled her into the situation that killed her, and he'd delayed calling for help to protect himself, making her death about his convenience even in the moment it was happening. The concept of complicated grief doesn't quite capture what BoJack experienced. He couldn't publicly mourn because acknowledging his role would mean admitting his guilt. He couldn't seek support because he'd lied to the police and couldn't risk telling anyone the truth. He couldn't escape the guilt because it was entirely earned. So he lived with it, carrying Sarah Lynn's death like a weight that grew heavier every day. Another thing he couldn't fix or undo or apologize away. Princess Carolyn watched BoJack spiral after Sarah Lynn's death and tried to help. But how do you help someone who's murdered someone else through negligence and selfishness? Diane noticed BoJack getting worse, but was dealing with her own failing marriage. Todd was finally starting to see BoJack clearly, to recognize the pattern of destruction that defined him. The support network that had enabled BoJack for years was beginning to fracture. People starting to realize that supporting BoJack meant being complicit in his damage. Sarah Lynn's death was the inevitable tragedy of BoJack's life, the culmination of every pattern and choice that had defined him. She'd needed protection as a child, and he'd failed to provide it. She'd needed support as an adult, and he'd exploited her instead. She'd needed help in her final moments, and he'd prioritized himself. Every selfish choice, every rationalization, every moment of choosing wrong had led to this. A young woman dead because BoJack Horseman couldn't stop being BoJack Horseman long enough to save her. After Sarah Lynn's death, BoJack was barely functional. He was drinking more, sleeping less, avoiding everyone who knew him well enough to ask questions. The guilt was not just about Sarah Lynn's death, but about everything. Herb, Charlotte, Penny, Kelsey, Todd, every person he'd hurt or disappointed or destroyed. The weight of being himself had become unbearable, but he didn't know how to be anyone else. Then came an unusual assignment. Princess Carolyn, in a desperate attempt to keep BoJack's career alive, and maybe give him something to focus on besides his guilt, booked him for a press tour promoting the Secretariat movie at the Pacific Ocean Film Festival. One of the obligations was an underwater interview, literally underwater in a submersible studio designed for aquatic species. BoJack would have to wear a special breathing apparatus and conduct an interview with a seahorse journalist while completely submerged. The underwater episode became a meditation on isolation and communication. BoJack couldn't speak properly with the breathing apparatus. Every attempt at words came out as muffled distortion. The seahorse interviewer asked him questions about his career, about Secretariat, about his life, and BoJack couldn't respond clearly. For once, his ability to perform and charm was completely stripped away. He was literally drowning in his inability to communicate. There's a profound psychology to this enforced silence. BoJack had spent his entire life using words to deflect, manipulate, charm, and hide. His verbal facility was his primary defense mechanism. Now, underwater and unable to speak, he was forced to simply be present, to experience his surroundings without the buffer of performance. It was terrifying and oddly peaceful. During this underwater segment, BoJack encountered a baby seahorse that had been separated from its parent. Rather than continuing with his obligations, BoJack spent hours swimming through the underwater city, trying to reunite the baby with its father. This act of care, helping someone small and vulnerable, asking nothing in return, simply doing the right thing because it was right, stood in stark contrast to how BoJack usually operated in the world. The search for the baby seahorse's father became a journey through an alien landscape. Underwater Los Angeles was familiar yet completely transformed. Buildings and businesses he knew from the surface existed in aquatic versions, populated by sea creatures living their lives in ways both similar to and radically different from surface dwellers. BoJack moved through this space silently, unable to explain himself, unable to charm his way through situations, forced to communicate through actions rather than words. This enforced focus on action over words was therapeutic in ways BoJack couldn't articulate. He wasn't thinking about Sarah Lynn or New Mexico or his failures. He was simply trying to help a baby seahorse find its father. The simplicity of this goal, do this one good thing, was almost meditative. There was no ambiguity, no complex moral calculus, just a straightforward mission that he could actually complete. When BoJack finally reunited the baby with its father, there was no applause, no gratitude he could understand, no reward beyond knowing he'd done something right. The seahorse father took his baby and swam away, and BoJack was left alone in the underwater city, still unable to speak, still isolated, but maybe slightly less burdened. He'd done one genuinely good thing, with no expectation of return, and it hadn't fixed him, but it had given him a glimpse of what it felt like to be someone who helped rather than hurt. The psychological concept of behavioral activation explains why this simple act of helping the seahorse was significant. Depression and guilt often trap people in rumination, thinking about problems without acting to solve them. Behavioral activation suggests that sometimes action precedes feeling. You do the right thing, even when you don't feel like it, and the feeling follows. BoJack didn't feel better before helping the seahorse. He felt slightly better because he'd helped the seahorse. When BoJack finally surfaced from the underwater studio, he'd missed most of his press obligations, and Princess Carolyn was furious. But something had shifted microscopically. BoJack had experienced a few hours of being genuinely helpful, of existing without his defensive mechanisms, of silence that wasn't just avoidance. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem him for Sarah Lynn or Penny or Herb. But it was a moment of being slightly less terrible, and that was something. Back on the surface, BoJack's problems remained unchanged. He still had to face the guilt of Sarah Lynn's death, still had to live with New Mexico, still had to navigate relationships with people he'd damaged. But the underwater experience lingered, a memory of what it felt like to be freed from the constant performance of being BoJack Horseman, to simply exist and try to help without expectation of reward. Around this time, BoJack's relationship with Princess Carolyn was reaching a breaking point. She'd spent years managing his career and his life, compensating for his dysfunction with her competence, believing that her effort could somehow save him. But Sarah Lynn's death had shaken her faith in this project. She was watching BoJack destroy himself and everyone around him, and her enabling, however well-intentioned, was part of the machinery of destruction. Princess Carolyn's own story was becoming clearer. She was addicted to fixing impossible things, to taking on challenges that proved her worth, to believing that if she just tried hard enough, she could make everything work. BoJack was her ultimate impossible project, and she'd invested years in the belief that he could be saved, that her effort mattered, that she could be the one who finally fixed him. But Sarah Lynn's death made her wonder if she was just enabling his destruction, if her competence was actually making it easier for him to avoid change. Todd, meanwhile, was finally seeing BoJack with clear eyes. He'd been living in BoJack's house for years, had been manipulated and betrayed repeatedly, and had generally been treated as an afterthought. The discovery that BoJack had sabotaged his rock opera, that BoJack's accidents had been deliberate manipulations, was devastating but clarifying. Todd was beginning to understand that BoJack's self-loathing didn't make him less capable of cruelty. It just gave him better excuses for it. The underwater episode, as strange as it was, represented something essential. The possibility that BoJack could exist differently, could act better even if he didn't feel better, could help rather than harm. But possibility isn't the same as actuality. The seahorse incident was a moment of grace, not a transformation. BoJack would have to choose, again and again, to be someone who helped rather than hurt. And his entire history suggested he wouldn't make that choice when it cost him anything. As 2018 approached, BoJack was in career limbo again. The Secretariat movie had come and gone without the Oscar nomination he'd fantasized about. He was back to being a has-been, with occasional work, famous enough to be recognized, but not relevant enough to matter. Princess Carolyn, still his manager despite everything, was trying to find him the next big thing that could revitalize his career. That thing turned out to be Filbert. Filbert was a prestige, streaming show about a detective with severe mental health issues, addiction problems, and a tendency to hurt everyone around him. The character was basically BoJack with a badge, self-destructive, narcissistic, charming enough to get away with terrible behavior, wrestling with demons that were more interesting than admirable. It was the kind of anti-hero prestige TV that was popular in this era, where difficult men were treated as complex rather than just difficult. The casting was too perfect to be comfortable. BoJack would be playing a character whose demons mirrored his own, performing a version of himself that was barely fictionalized. The show's creator, Flip McVicker, was a difficult auteur type who saw Filbert as profound commentary on masculinity, trauma, and morality. But really, it was just another show that glamorized male dysfunction, that treated self-awareness about being terrible as equivalent to actually being better. Diane and Wynne was hired as a consultant on Filbert, which meant BoJack and Diane would be working together closely for the first time since she'd written his memoir. Their friendship had survived the kiss incident, had been tested by BoJack's continued destructiveness, and was now strained by Diane's failing marriage to Mr. Peanut Butter. She was dealing with her own depression, her own questions about what kind of life she wanted, and her own tendency to believe she could fix things through understanding them. The production of Filbert became a hall of mirrors. BoJack was playing a character written to be him, interpreting lines that were essentially his own thoughts, performing his dysfunction for cameras that would broadcast it to millions. The boundary between BoJack and Filbert began to dissolve. Was he acting or just being himself? Were Filbert's demons a commentary on BoJack's, or was BoJack's life just research for the character? During production, BoJack was prescribed painkillers for a back injury. Given his history with substances, given Sarah Lynn's recent death from an overdose, given every pattern in his life, starting prescription opioids was obviously dangerous. But BoJack told himself it was fine, that he was in control, that he needed them for legitimate pain. This is the classic logic of addiction, convincing yourself that this time is different, that you can handle it, that the rules that apply to others don't apply to you. The painkillers mixed with alcohol became BoJack's new normal. He would show up to set intoxicated, functioning but not fully present, his performance becoming a blur, where he couldn't distinguish between acting and being. The crew noticed, but said nothing. Difficult behavior from stars was tolerated, even expected. Princess Carolyn noticed, but felt helpless. She'd been managing BoJack's dysfunction for so long that she didn't know how to stop enabling it. Diane was writing episodes of Filbert while watching BoJack deteriorate, trying to make the show say something meaningful about male dysfunction while participating in a production that was actually just glorifying it. She wrote an episode where Filbert strangles a woman, a dark moment that was supposed to be a commentary on violence, but that BoJack performed with disturbing intensity. The line between artistic exploration of darkness and actual darkness was completely eroded. Then came the incident with Gina Cazador. Gina was BoJack's co-star on Filbert, a talented actress who was trying to be taken seriously after years of genre work. She and BoJack developed a relationship that was romantic and dysfunctional, built on mutual attraction and BoJack's completely inability to be in a healthy relationship. Gina genuinely liked BoJack, saw his potential underneath the damage, believed she could be the relationship that actually worked. But BoJack, deep in his painkiller addiction and emotional chaos, was barely holding it together. During the filming of the strangulation scene, BoJack, high and not fully aware of reality, actually strangled Gina. He didn't stop when the director yelled "cut," didn't respond to her resistance, was trapped in some space between performance and reality, where he couldn't distinguish between acting violent and being violent. The crew had to pull him off her. Gina was physically fine, bruised, shaken, but not permanently injured. Emotionally, she was devastated. BoJack had assaulted her on set, in front of dozens of witnesses, while cameras rolled. It was documented, undeniable, a clear act of violence. This should have been the end of BoJack's career, the moment his dysfunction finally caught up with him in a way he couldn't escape or rationalize. But Gina made a choice. She didn't want to be defined as the actress BoJack Horseman strangled. She didn't want her career to become about being his victim. She didn't want every future role, every interview, every moment to be colored by this incident. So she convinced everyone to cover it up, to call it an accident, to protect BoJack's reputation, to preserve her own privacy and career. This moment crystallized everything toxic about Hollywood and about BoJack. A woman had been assaulted, and the machinery of the industry worked to protect the perpetrator. Gina's choice was understandable. She was trying to protect herself from being reduced to this trauma, but it meant BoJack faced no consequences again. He'd crossed another line, hurt another person, and the world conspired to let him get away with it. The realization that he'd strangled Gina sent BoJack into a dark spiral. The painkiller addiction was undeniable now. The violence was undeniable. The pattern of destruction was undeniable. He checked himself into rehab, finally, after years of people suggesting it, after decades of substance abuse. But was it because he wanted to change, or because the alternative was facing consequences? Princess Carolyn, watching all of this unfold, finally hit her own breaking point. She realized she'd spent years of her life managing a person who didn't want to change, who only wanted to be managed. She'd compensated for his dysfunction so completely that she'd enabled it. Her competence had been his permission to stay incompetent. The project of fixing BoJack had consumed years that she could have spent building her own life, pursuing her own dreams, having the family she desperately wanted. Todd had already left BoJack's house, had already started building a life independent of BoJack's chaos. Diane was reevaluating her friendship with BoJack, questioning whether understanding someone's demons was the same as being obligated to tolerate their destructiveness. The support system that had cushioned BoJack's falls for decades was disintegrating. People finally realizing that you can't save someone who refuses to save themselves. As BoJack entered rehab, The Filbert Show aired to critical acclaim and popular success. Audiences loved watching this difficult, destructive man stumble through cases and relationships, loved the performance of self-awareness that felt like actual growth, even though it wasn't. BoJack had succeeded again at the exact thing he always succeeded at, getting rewarded for performing a better version of himself while the actual self remained unchanged. But this time, the cost of that performance had been strangling someone, and even BoJack couldn't quite rationalize that away. BoJack entered Pastiche's Malibu Rehabilitation Center in late 2018, checking in under the name Chadwick Boseman, in a half-hearted attempt at anonymity that fooled no one. Rehab represented both genuine desperation and familiar performance. He needed help, yes, but he was also seeking another narrative where he could be the person trying to change, rather than the person causing harm. The distinction between actually changing and performing change had always been unclear to BoJack, and rehab was no exception. Pastiche's was an upscale facility, the kind where celebrities go to get clean with thread counts and ocean views. The program was structured but comfortable, offering therapy, group sessions, equine-assisted activities, and the kind of careful, professional support that money can buy. BoJack's roommate was a former comedian named Jameson, whose own addiction struggles mirrored his, while also being distinctly her own. Rehab was full of people with their own stories, their own traumas, their own reasons for seeking change or escaping consequences. Dr. Champ was the rehab counselor who took primary responsibility for BoJack's treatment. Dr. Champ was a horse like BoJack, a former Olympic athlete whose own struggles with alcoholism had led him to recovery work. He'd been sober for years, had rebuilt his life, and represented the possibility that change was actually achievable. But Dr. Champ also had his own fragility, his own barely managed demons, his own performance of having it all together that was less stable than it appeared. The psychology of addiction recovery is complex and personal. For BoJack, substances weren't just about numbing pain. They were about avoiding responsibility, creating a ready excuse for bad behavior, maintaining the illusion that his problems were chemical rather than characterological. Getting sober meant he couldn't blame alcohol or pills for his choices anymore. He would have to face the reality that sober BoJack was capable of the same cruelty as drunk BoJack, just with fewer excuses. In group therapy, BoJack was confronted with other people's stories, trauma, loss, addiction, recovery. He was used to being the center of attention, but here everyone had their own nightmare, their own version of hitting bottom. BoJack's fame didn't insulate him from the work of recovery. If anything, it made it harder because he was used to charm and performance-solving problems that required genuine vulnerability and change. During his time at Pastiches, BoJack began to engage with his past more honestly than he ever had. He talked about his parents, Butterscotch's cruelty, Beatrice's coldness, the childhood that had taught him he was unworthy of love. He talked about Herb, about the betrayal that had launched his career and haunted his conscience. He talked about Sarah Lynn, though he couldn't bring himself to tell the full truth about the 17 minutes he'd waited before calling 911. He talked about his patterns, his failures, his awareness that he kept hurting people while claiming to want to stop. The concept of insight versus action is crucial in addiction recovery. BoJack had always had insight. He knew his patterns, understood his psychology, could articulate his traumas with uncomfortable precision. But insight without action is just another form of avoidance. Knowing why you do something wrong doesn't mean you've stopped doing it. BoJack was great at analyzing himself. He was terrible at actually changing based on that analysis. One of BoJack's assignments in rehab was to write letters to people he'd harmed. He was supposed to apologize, take responsibility, and not expect forgiveness or response. This exercise was excruciating. BoJack drafted letters to Herb, though he was dead, to Sarah Lynn, also dead, to Penny, to Gina, to Princess Carolyn, to Todd, to Kelsey, to everyone. Writing them meant confronting what he'd actually done, stripped of rationalization or context. The letters sat unsent because sending them would make his actions real in a way he still couldn't fully tolerate. Meanwhile, outside rehab, BoJack's world was shifting. Princess Carolyn had finally stepped back from managing him, recognizing that she needed to prioritize her own life. She was pursuing adoption, trying to create the family she'd always wanted, realizing that she'd spent years mothering BoJack while denying herself actual motherhood. Todd had completely rebuilt his life, finding community, purpose, and identity, independent of BoJack. Diane was struggling with her own depression, but was no longer looking to BoJack for her problems. In rehab, BoJack also confronted his relationship with his mother, Beatrice. She was now in a memory care facility, suffering from dementia, barely recognizing anyone. BoJack visited her, hoping for something. An apology, acknowledgement, some explanation that would make sense of his childhood. But Beatrice's dementia had erased most of her memories, leaving her confused, frightened, and occasionally cruel in ways that felt less intentional than habitual. The visit to Beatrice was devastating. BoJack realized he would never get the apology or explanation he wanted. His mother would die without ever acknowledging the damage she'd done, without ever explaining why she'd been so cruel to a child who'd done nothing but exist. This lack of closure forced BoJack to accept that some things can't be resolved. Some wounds can't be healed by the people who caused them. He would have to find peace without his mother's participation. In a moment of strange compassion, BoJack lied to his mother. He told her she was staying at her family's summer home, created a fiction where her son had died in the war, but she'd lived a good life, gave her a story where she could rest. It was a kindness, but it was also revealing. BoJack could be kind when the recipient was helpless, when his kindness cost him nothing and bought him nothing. Could he be kind when it required sacrifice? Dr. Champ's own sobriety was fragile, maintained through routine and avoidance rather than genuine internal change. When his routines were disrupted, when stress increased, his recovery began to crack. This was a warning to BoJack. Sobriety isn't a permanent state, but an ongoing choice, a practice that requires constant maintenance. You're never fixed, just choosing moment by moment to not use, to not fall back into old patterns. Toward the end of BoJack's planned stay at Pastiches, he was offered a teaching position at Wesleyan University. His alma mater wanted him to teach an acting class. This opportunity represented a possible future. BoJack as mentor, giving back, using his experience to help young actors avoid his mistakes. It was redemptive, purposeful, a way to matter that wasn't just about fame. Princess Caroline had arranged it, still looking out for him, despite stepping back from management. But before BoJack could fully embrace this new possibility, his past began catching up in ways he couldn't control. A reporter named Paige Sinclair and her intern Maximilian Banks had been investigating Sarah Lynn's death. They'd found inconsistencies in the official story, had tracked down witnesses, were piecing together what had actually happened. The 17 minutes BoJack had waited before calling 911 was discoverable through phone records and testimony. The truth was coming out. BoJack left rehab, believing he'd changed, believing he'd done the work, believing he was ready to be someone better. He'd been sober for months, had engaged in therapy, had started to confront his past. But had he actually changed? Or had he just performed changing in a new setting? Was his sobriety genuine transformation? Or was it just another role? BoJack Horseman as recovering addict, performing the redemption arc his life had lacked. The question of whether BoJack had genuinely changed in rehab is complicated. He'd made progress, certainly. He'd been vulnerable in ways that were new, had confronted truths he'd previously avoided, had practiced sobriety and therapy. But change is a process, not an event. Leaving rehab sober and insightful wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning of a much harder phase. Maintaining that change in the real world, where triggers were constant and accountability was optional. As BoJack prepared to leave Pastiches and start his teaching job at Wesleyan, he was cautiously hopeful for maybe the first time in his life. He had a purpose, had worked on himself, had people who still believed in him despite everything. But hope, for someone with BoJack's history, was fragile, and the investigation into Sarah Lynn's death was accelerating, the truth getting closer to exposure. BoJack was about to learn that you can't actually outrun your past, that consequences eventually catch up, and that the redemption he'd been performing at would be tested by the reality of what he'd actually done. BoJack's teaching position at Wesleyan University began in early 2019, and, for a brief window, it seemed like he might actually be building a different life. He was sober, purposeful, Removed from Hollywood's toxicity, his students were earnest and talented, interested in his wisdom and experience. He was giving back, mentoring, doing something that mattered beyond himself. It felt like redemption, like maybe all the suffering had led somewhere meaningful. But the past isn't something you escape by changing geography or getting sober. Paige Sinclair and Maximilian Banks, the reporters investigating Sarah Lynn's death, had compiled damning evidence. They discovered the 17-minute gap between when Sarah Lynn overdosed and when BoJack called 911. They'd talked to people who were at the bender, who knew BoJack had pulled Sarah Lynn off sobriety. They'd built a case that, while maybe not criminal in a prosecutable sense, was devastating in its moral clarity. BoJack Horseman had caused Sarah Lynn's death through negligence and selfishness. The reporters took their story to media outlets, trying to get it published. Initially, they faced resistance. BoJack was famous, but not important enough to risk libel suits over, and the story was complicated enough that editors were hesitant. But information like this doesn't stay contained. It started leaking through gossip sites, social media, the whisper network of entertainment journalism. The story was getting out, and BoJack couldn't stop it. Around the same time, another piece of his past surfaced. The New Mexico incident with Penny. Someone had obtained a copy of Penny's medical records from the night Maddie had to go to the emergency room. Records that showed BoJack had been the responsible adult. Connecting dots, making assumptions, the narrative emerged. BoJack Horseman, in his 50 seconds, had gone to New Mexico and done something inappropriate with a high schooler. The exact details were fuzzy in the reporting, but the implication was clear and damning. Penny herself was pulled into the media storm against her will. Reporters contacted her, asking for her side of the story. She'd spent years trying to forget that night, trying to move past the confusion and trauma of almost something terrible happening. Now it was being made public, her privacy violated, her trauma becoming entertainment. Penny gave an interview where she was honest but restrained, saying BoJack had been inappropriate, but nothing physical had happened. It was more generous than BoJack deserved. The revelations came rapid fire. Sarah Lynn, New Mexico, the Gina strangulation that had been covered up, the pattern of narcissism and destruction that defined BoJack's relationships. Each story added to the others, creating a portrait of someone who'd been given chance after chance and had wasted all of them. Social media erupted with opinions, some defending BoJack as a product of his era and trauma, most condemning him for behaviors that were indefensible regardless of explanation. Biscuits Braxby, a famous TV interviewer, wanted to do an exclusive sit-down with BoJack, Princess Carolyn, still watching out for him despite everything, advised against it. Diane, his closest remaining friend, told him that doing the interview would be a mistake, that he couldn't charm his way out of this. But BoJack, convinced he could explain, convinced he could make people understand, agreed to the interview. The interview was a disaster. Biscuits Braxby was professional but relentless, asking about Sarah Lynn, about New Mexico, about the pattern of behavior. BoJack tried to explain the context, tried to make people understand the circumstances, tried to separate his intentions from his actions, but every explanation sounded like an excuse. Every attempt at vulnerability came across as manipulation. He couldn't perform his way out of this, because performance was part of the problem. The worst moment of the interview was when BoJack tried to claim he'd changed, that rehab had transformed him, that he was someone different now. Biscuits asked, "If you've changed, why did you wait 17 minutes to call 911 for Sarah Lynn? What were you doing during those minutes?" BoJack couldn't answer honestly, The truth was that he'd been panicking, thinking about himself, protecting his own interests while Sarah Lynn died. Any honest answer would be self-incriminating, but any dishonest answer would be obviously so. The concept of public versus private self collapsed for BoJack during this interview. He'd spent his life managing his public image, keeping his private awfulness hidden. Now the private was becoming public, and he had no tools for managing it. The persona of BoJack Horseman, the lovable screw-up, couldn't accommodate BoJack Horseman who let someone die to avoid inconvenience. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable for him, and for the Bess audience watching. After the interview aired, BoJack was cancelled in the modern sense, not just criticised, but expelled from public life. His shows were pulled from streaming services. His colleagues issued statements distancing themselves from him. The teaching position at Wesleyan was revoked. Companies that had used his image demanded retractions. He went from famous to infamous to irrelevant in a matter of weeks. Princess Carolyn, watching this unfold, felt a complicated mix of vindication and grief. She'd spent years managing BoJack's dysfunction, enabling his worst behaviours while trying to save him from himself. Part of her had always known this was coming. You can't betray that many people, cause that much harm, and escape consequences forever. But she'd hoped, against her better judgment, that BoJack would somehow become the person he could have been. Todd had long since moved on from BoJack, had built a life where BoJack was just a regrettable chapter. When the revelations hit, Todd felt vindicated in his decision to cut BoJack out of his life. He'd known, on some level, that BoJack was capable of this level of harm. The surprise wasn't the behaviour, but that it had taken this long for consequences to arrive. Todd had stopped hoping BoJack would change. He'd just hoped BoJack would stop hurting people he cared about. Diane was perhaps the most conflicted. She'd understood BoJack better than almost anyone had written his memoir, knowing his flaws and forgiving them in context. But understanding someone's demons doesn't obligate you to excuse their destructiveness. She told BoJack that he wasn't a bad person, just someone who did bad things. But maybe the distinction didn't matter if the result was the same. She wrote an essay about BoJack, about the culture that enabled men like him, about her own complicity in that enabling. The psychological concept of accountability became central to discussions of BoJack. For decades, he'd avoided real consequences through wealth, charm, and the entertainment industry's tolerance of difficult men. He'd acknowledged his behaviours, felt guilty about them, but never faced proportional consequences. Now, finally, he was being held accountable not by the legal system, but by the court of public opinion. It was messy, imperfect, sometimes cruel, but it was accountability nonetheless. BoJack's response to being cancelled was predictable. He isolated, drank, spiraled into depression. The sobriety he'd maintained since rehab was broken. The purpose he'd found in teaching was gone. The redemption narrative he'd been building collapsed. He was back to being himself at his worst, but now without the social cushioning that had previously protected him from full accountability. The question became, what does accountability actually achieve? Does public shaming lead to private growth? Does cancellation prevent future harm, or just exile the harmer? BoJack was suffering, certainly. Depression, isolation, the loss of everything he'd identified with. But was he learning? Was he becoming someone who wouldn't cause future harm, or just someone who'd been punished for past harm? The distinction matters, but it's unclear which was happening. As BoJack hit this new bottom, sober in rehab was one thing, drunk and cancelled was another. He faced a choice that he'd avoided his entire life: actually change, or die remaining exactly who he'd always been. The cultural moment wouldn't forgive him. The people he'd hurt wouldn't console him. The career he'd built was destroyed. He had nothing left but himself. And himself had always been the problem. What do you do when you can't run from yourself anymore? When all the exits are closed and you're trapped with the person you've spent your life trying to avoid being? After the interview disaster and the complete implosion of his public image, BoJack did what he'd always done when reality became unbearable. He drank. The sobriety that had seemed so solid in rehab evaporated when faced with real consequences. He'd been sober when life was structured and supportive. Now, life was chaotic and hostile, and alcohol was the familiar anesthetic. He drank alone in his house, surrounded by memorabilia from a career that had become synonymous with harm, trapped with the reality of who he was. In his intoxication and despair, BoJack did something that was either incredibly stupid or subconsciously intentional. He broke into his old house, the house where he'd grown up in San Francisco, the house that had been empty since his parents died. It was late at night. He was severely drunk, and he somehow thought returning to the scene of his original trauma would provide. What? Answers? Closure? A reason to forgive himself for becoming the person that House had created? The house was exactly as he remembered. The same cruel angles, the same suffocating atmosphere, the same sense of being watched and judged and found wanting. BoJack wandered through rooms where his father had told him he was worthless, where his mother had looked at him with disappointment, where he'd learned that his existence was a burden. Being there drunk felt appropriate. The child he'd been was finally home, and he was exactly what his parents had predicted he'd become. Then BoJack fell. The house was in disrepair, the second floor unstable, and in his intoxication he missed a step or a warning sign. He fell into the pool, which was empty except for some standing water. The fall should have killed him. The height, the concrete, the impact. Somehow it didn't, but he was severely injured, barely conscious, lying in the empty pool of his childhood home, unable to move, possibly dying. This moment, BoJack in the pool, unable to escape, facing death, was the ultimate metaphor for his life. He'd spent decades trying to escape this house, this childhood, this foundational trauma, but he'd never actually left. He'd just recreated the dynamics of his parents' house in every relationship and situation, and now he was literally back where he started, trapped, potentially dying, alone with the truth that he'd never escaped anything. BoJack was found and rescued, taken to a hospital, survived the fall but faced criminal charges for breaking and entering. The legal system, which had largely ignored him previously, was now paying attention. He was arrested, prosecuted, and despite Princess Caroline hiring good lawyers, sentenced to prison. The sentence was relatively short, 14 months in a minimum security facility. But for BoJack, prison represented the ultimate loss of control and comfort. Prison was clarity. For the first time in his life, BoJack couldn't buy, charm, or perform his way out of consequences. He couldn't hire someone to manage his problems. He couldn't drink or use drugs to numb reality. He was just another inmate, stripped of fame and identity, facing the basic human challenge of existing in a structured environment where his needs and preferences didn't matter. The prison BoJack was sent to wasn't particularly harsh. Minimum security, mostly white-collar criminals. Structured, but not brutal. But for someone who'd spent his entire life avoiding accountability and discipline, even minimum security was a shock. He had a routine dictated by others, rules he couldn't break, no escape from himself or other people. He had to work in the prison, had to follow orders, had to be just another person, rather than BoJack Horseman the celebrity. In prison, BoJack couldn't avoid confronting reality. He couldn't perform anymore because no one cared about his performance. His fellow inmates knew who he was, but didn't revere him. Some were contemptuous, some indifferent, none were impressed. The guards treated him like any other inmate. He was nobody special, which was both humiliating and oddly freeing. For the first time since Horsing Around, he wasn't performing being BoJack Horseman. The psychological concept of ego death partially applies here. BoJack's identity had been built on fame, on being recognized, on mattering in the public sphere. Prison stripped that away. He was just another body in orange, following rules, doing assigned tasks, existing without the validation of recognition. This erasure of his public identity forced him to confront his private identity, or the lack thereof. Who was he if not famous? Who was he if not performing? During his time in prison, BoJack developed something resembling humility. Not the performed humility he'd occasionally displayed in interviews, but actual humility born from having no power or control. He couldn't manipulate his circumstances, couldn't charm the guards, couldn't buy better conditions. He was subject to the same rules as everyone else, and this enforced equality was educational in ways decades of therapy hadn't been. Prison also meant he couldn't avoid the other inmates' stories. He was surrounded by people who'd made bad choices, caused harm, and were now facing consequences. Some were remorseful, some were bitter, some were just trying to survive. Hearing their stories, recognizing his own patterns in theirs, BoJack began to see himself as part of a larger pattern of human brokenness rather than uniquely terrible. This perspective didn't excuse his behavior, but it complicated his self-narrative. While BoJack was in prison, life continued outside. Princess Carolyn had finally achieved her dream of having a child, adopting a daughter she named Ruthie. She was building the family she'd always wanted, creating something beautiful and real that had nothing to do with managing difficult men or compensating for their dysfunction. She'd finally prioritized herself, and it had led to genuine happiness. Todd had continued building his life, finding community and purpose and identity. He was working in various entrepreneurial ventures, had formed meaningful relationships, and had largely moved past the BoJack chapter of his life. He didn't hate BoJack. Hate requires more energy and care than Todd was willing to invest. But he'd accepted that BoJack was someone who'd hurt him and would likely hurt others, and that maintaining distance was the healthiest choice. Diane was dealing with her own struggles, her divorce from Mr. Peanut Butter, her depression, her questions about what kind of writing mattered. She'd moved to Chicago, started a new relationship with someone kind and stable, and was trying to build a life that prioritized her well-being over her productivity. Her relationship with BoJack had taught her important lessons about enabling, about the difference between understanding and excusing, about protecting herself even from people she cared about. Toward the end of his sentence, BoJack was granted a weekend furlough to attend Princess Carolyn's wedding. This temporary release from prison was conditional and closely monitored, but it represented a small recognition that he'd been behaving well, following rules, not causing problems. The wedding would be his first time seeing his old life since prison, his first interaction with people who knew him as something other than just another inmate. The furlough was both gift and test. Could BoJack exist in his old world without falling back into old patterns? Could he be genuinely happy for Princess Carolyn without making it about himself? Could he handle alcohol being present without drinking? Could he interact with people who'd been hurt by his behavior without defensive or manipulative? The furlough would answer these questions, revealing whether his time in prison had actually changed him, or just temporarily suppressed his worst impulses. Prison had given BoJack something he'd never had before: genuine consequences that couldn't be avoided, delayed, or mitigated. He'd had to face reality without the cushion of fame, money, or enablers. He'd had to be disciplined because he had no choice. He'd had to be humble because arrogance was punished. Whether this enforced structure had led to internal change or just external compliance remained to be seen. But at minimum, prison had given him something he'd always lacked: a clear external boundary between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, enforced consistently, regardless of his feelings or justifications. The weekend furlough brought BoJack back to Los Angeles, to the world he'd left when he was sentenced to prison. The city looked the same, but BoJack's relationship to it had shifted. He wasn't arriving as a celebrity to be celebrated or enabled. He was a convicted criminal on temporary release, monitored and constrained. The freedom was conditional, limited, precious because it could be revoked at any moment. Princess Carolyn's wedding to Judah, her competent and caring assistant who'd become her partner, represented everything BoJack had never achieved: genuine partnership, stability, mutual respect, the building of something real rather than just the performance of a relationship. Seeing Princess Carolyn this happy, this settled, this free from the burden of trying to save him was complicated for BoJack. He was genuinely happy for her, but also confronted with what she'd only achieved by stepping away from him. At the wedding, BoJack reconnected with people from his past. Todd was there, cordial but distant, treating BoJack like an acquaintance, rather than someone who'd once been central to his life. This distance was healthy for Todd, but painful for BoJack, a reminder of what he'd lost through his own behaviors. Mr. Peanut Butter was there with his new girlfriend, still optimistic and friendly, but no longer invested in BoJack's drama. Everyone had moved on, built lives that didn't revolve around managing or enabling BoJack's dysfunction. Diane arrived at the wedding, and she and BoJack had their first real conversation since his imprisonment. They found a quiet spot, away from the celebration, and talked with the honesty that had always characterized their friendship. Diane told BoJack about her new life in Chicago, about the relationship that was working because it was built on healthy patterns, about the writing she was doing that felt meaningful even if it wasn't grand. She'd found something resembling peace by accepting her limitations and working within them. BoJack and Diane's conversation on the roof of the wedding venue became the emotional core of his furlough. They talked about whether people can really change, whether BoJack specifically had changed. Diane was honest but not cruel. She said that maybe BoJack was different now, but that difference didn't erase what he'd done. The people he'd hurt were still hurt. The damage was still damage. Growth doesn't undo the past. It just means you stop adding to the pile of harm. The psychological concept of acceptance was central to their conversation. Not acceptance as giving up or excusing, but acceptance as acknowledging reality without the constant filter of justification or denial. BoJack had spent his life running from reality, and Diane had spent hers trying to change it through writing. They'd both learned, through different painful paths, that acceptance was the prerequisite for any genuine change. You can't fix what you won't acknowledge. During the wedding, BoJack had to navigate the presence of alcohol. Open bar, champagne toasts, celebration lubricated by drinking, all his old triggers were present. In the past, he would have used this as an excuse to drink, telling himself that one glass couldn't hurt, that he could control it this time, that he deserved to celebrate. But prison had taught him something about following rules, even when he didn't want to, about understanding that some boundaries existed for good reason. BoJack didn't drink at the wedding. It wasn't a grand dramatic choice. He just quietly abstained, drinking soda water while others had champagne, staying present without numbing. This small act of discipline, invisible to most people, represented real growth. He'd made a choice that prioritized his long-term well-being over his immediate comfort, without expecting recognition or praise for it. That's what actual change looks like. Not dramatic gestures, but quiet, consistent choices that no one else notices. The wedding was genuinely joyful. Princess Carolyn and Judah's vows were personal and authentic. Two people who saw each other clearly and chose each other anyway. Their daughter Ruthie was there, representing the future Princess Carolyn had built for herself. The celebration felt earned, real, built on actual relationship rather than performance. BoJack watched this and felt something he'd rarely experienced: genuine happiness for someone else without resentment or envy. As the furlough ended and BoJack had to return to prison, he had a final conversation with Diane on the roof. They sat in silence for a while, looking at the city, at the stars, at each other. The conversation was about endings and beginnings, about accepting that some relationships serve their purpose and then need to end, about gratitude for what was without demanding more than is healthy. Diane told BoJack that this might be the last time they saw each other, not out of anger or rejection, but because she'd learned that maintaining distance from people who'd harmed her was necessary for her own health. She loved BoJack in a complicated way, understood him better than almost anyone. But understanding someone doesn't mean you're obligated to keep them in your life. She was choosing herself, and she did it with kindness rather than cruelty. BoJack understood. For maybe the first time, he didn't try to talk someone out of leaving him, didn't manipulate or guilt them into staying, didn't make their healthy boundary about his feelings. He accepted Diane's choice, thanked her for everything, and let her go. This acceptance, this ability to prioritize someone else's needs over his own desire for continued connection, was genuine growth. The BoJack of a year ago couldn't have done this. The final scene of BoJack's time outside prison was him and Diane sitting on the roof, talking about life as the stars moved overhead. They talked about whether life is about the big moments or the small ones, whether growth is dramatic or incremental, whether happiness is finding peace or making meaning. The conversation was philosophical, calm, sad but not despairing. Two people who'd known each other in complicated ways, saying goodbye with honesty and care. Then BoJack had to leave, return to prison, finish his sentence. As he left the wedding, he looked back at the celebration, all these people he'd known, who were now living lives that had moved past him. He wasn't the center of anyone's story anymore, wasn't the problem that needed solving. He was just someone they used to know, someone who'd been part of their past, someone they could remember without being consumed by. Returning to prison felt different after the furlough. BoJack had tasted temporary freedom, had seen what life looked like when you weren't at the center of it, had practiced making healthy choices in difficult situations. He had a few more months to serve, and he could spend them preparing for what came next, or he could spend them wallowing in what he'd lost. For once, he seemed to be choosing preparation over wallowing. The wedding furlough represented a test of whether BoJack had actually changed, and he'd passed. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but adequately. He'd been around triggers and hadn't relapsed. He'd been around people he'd hurt and hadn't made it about his guilt. He'd been happy for someone else without resentment. He'd accepted rejection without manipulation. These small victories didn't erase his past, but they suggested a different possible future. As BoJack settled back into prison routine, he began thinking about what would happen when he was released. He couldn't return to his old life that was gone, burned down by his own behaviors and the consequences that finally arrived. But what would a new life look like? What does someone do after being cancelled, imprisoned, stripped of everything they'd built? How do you move forward when you can't move back? The answer, emerging slowly, was that you live small, not the big dramatic redemption arc, not the Hollywood comeback story, not the grand gesture of transformation, just small, consistent, daily choices to be slightly better than you were yesterday, to help when you can, to avoid harm when possible, to accept that you're not the center of the universe, and that's actually a relief. BoJack was beginning to understand that the life he'd always wanted, grand, famous, significant, had been the problem. Maybe the life worth living was one where you were just another person, doing small good things, existing without causing harm. BoJack Horseman's story doesn't have the neat resolution that fictional stories usually provide. He wasn't fully redeemed. He wasn't destroyed. He existed in that uncomfortable middle space where real people live, partially changed, carrying permanent consequences, neither saved nor condemned, but simply continuing to exist with the weight of everything he'd done and been. After his release from prison in 2020, BoJack's life became smaller and quieter. He couldn't return to acting. He was essentially blacklisted, and his reputation ensured no legitimate productions would hire him. The money from horsing around residuals was gone, spent or lost in legal fees and settlements to people he'd harmed. The house in the Hollywood Hills, that monument to his past success, was sold to pay debts. Everything that had defined him was stripped away, leaving only the person underneath. This stripping away of external identity forced BoJack to confront a question he'd avoided his entire life. Who are you when you're not famous, not wealthy, not defined by your career or reputation? The psychological concept of ego dissolution suggests that sometimes losing your false identity is the prerequisite for discovering your actual self. BoJack had spent decades building and maintaining a persona. Now he had no choice but to exist as just a person. The life BoJack built after prison was deliberately modest. He took a job teaching acting at a small community college, not the prestigious university position he'd lost, but a humble teaching role, helping adult students pursue their creative interests. The students didn't know or care about his fame. They just wanted someone who understood performance and could help them improve. Teaching these students, with no expectation of glory or recognition, became BoJack's new purpose. The themes of BoJack Horseman as a story are worth examining as we conclude this retelling. The show was fundamentally about whether people can change, whether self-awareness is enough, whether understanding your damage excuses perpetuating it. BoJack understood himself better than almost anyone. He could articulate his traumas, analyze his patterns, predict his failures, but understanding didn't prevent him from continuing to harm people. The gap between knowing better and doing better is where the show lived. Another central theme was the question of accountability. For decades, BoJack avoided real consequences through privilege, charm, and an industry that tolerated destructive men. The show asked, what does it mean to hold someone accountable? Is public shaming accountability? Is prison? Is losing everything? Or is accountability something internal, a relationship you have with your own conscience? The answer seemed to be, it's all of these things, messy and imperfect, never as satisfying as we want it to be. The show also explored generational trauma, how damage passes from parent to child, how Beatrice's cruelty came from her father's cruelty, how BoJack's pain was inflicted on others who would carry it forward. Breaking these cycles requires more than awareness. It requires the difficult work of choosing differently, despite every instinct and learned pattern pushing you toward repetition. BoJack managed, barely, to break some cycles. He didn't have children who he could damage in the ways he'd been damaged, but he'd caused harm to enough people that the cycle continued in different forms. The psychology of addiction ran throughout the story as well. Addiction to substances, yes, but also addiction to validation, to fame, to the brief highs of new relationships, to anything that could temporarily fill the void of unworthiness. BoJack learned that sobriety from substances was only one part of recovery. He also had to develop sobriety from his need to be at the center of attention, from his belief that he was special enough to deserve exceptions to moral rules. The show's treatment of depression and mental illness was notably complex. BoJack was clearly depressed, possibly had personality disorders, certainly had PTSD from his childhood. But the show refused to let these diagnoses become excuses. Yes, BoJack was damaged. Yes, his mental health struggles were real. But so was his capacity to choose better and his consistent choosing of worse. The line between "I can't help it" and "I won't help it" was interrogated ruthlessly. Philosophically, the show engaged with questions of existentialism and meaning. In a universe that doesn't care about you, where there's no inherent purpose or divine plan, what makes life worth living? BoJack spent years believing that fame, success, and external validation could provide meaning. He learned, slowly and painfully, that meaning comes from smaller things, genuine connection, being present for others, creating small pockets of good in an indifferent universe, accepting that enough doesn't need to mean extraordinary. The recurring motif of performance versus authenticity threaded through the entire narrative. BoJack was always performing charm, performing humility, performing growth, performing self-awareness. Even his most vulnerable moments were sometimes performances of vulnerability. The question the show asked was, if you perform being better for long enough, does it eventually become real? Can you fake it until you make it? Or does the performance itself prevent genuine transformation? The show also examined what it means to be good. BoJack wanted to be considered a good person, but he wanted this designation without doing the consistent work that goodness requires. He wanted the label without the practice. The show suggested that goodness isn't a state you achieve, but a series of choices you make. That you're only as good as your last action. That intention without action is meaningless. Being aware that you're hurting someone while continuing to hurt them doesn't make you better than someone who hurts people unknowingly. In terms of relationships, the show explored how damaged people damage others, how pain propagates outward, how enabling and codependency can masquerade as love. Princess Carolyn spent years loving BoJack in a way that hurt them both. Diane loved him by holding up a mirror, which was more helpful but also more painful. Todd loved him by eventually leaving, recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing is to refuse to be hurt anymore. Each relationship taught BoJack something different about connection and its costs. The ending of BoJack's story, such as it is, doesn't provide the satisfaction of complete redemption or total destruction. He lives a small life, teaching community college students, working a day job, attending AA meetings, staying sober most days. He has occasional contact with some people from his past, but he's no longer central to anyone's life. He's alone more often than not, which he's learning to tolerate, rather than fill with substances or destructive behaviors. The final question the show poses is this enough? Is living a small, careful life where you minimize harm enough of a redemption? BoJack will never undo what he did to Sarah Lynn, to Penny, to Herb, to everyone. He'll carry that damage forever, and so will his victims. But he's also stopped adding to the pile of harm. He exists without causing new disasters. He occasionally helps his students, occasionally makes small positive differences, occasionally manages to be genuinely present for another person without making it about himself. Perhaps the most profound realization BoJack comes to is that he's not special. Not special enough that normal rules don't apply to him. Not special enough that his pain excuses his cruelty. Not special enough that the universe owes him happiness or success. He's just another damaged person trying to get through life without causing too much harm, and accepting that ordinariness is actually the prerequisite for any genuine peace. As we close this retelling of BoJack Horseman's story, meant to guide you gently towards sleep, consider this. BoJack's story is extreme in its details, but universal in its themes. We all carry damage from how we were raised. We all have patterns we repeat, despite knowing better. We all have people we've hurt and can't fully make amends to. We all have the gap between who we wish we were and who we actually are. The question isn't whether you're broken. Everyone is broken in some way. But what you do with that brokenness. Do you use it as an excuse to continue causing harm, or as motivation to at least try to cause less? BoJack Horseman learned, eventually, that trying is all you can do. Not trying and succeeding perfectly. Not being redeemed completely. Just trying, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment, to be slightly less terrible than your worst instincts push you to be. It's unglamorous, unsatisfying, and often feels inadequate, but it's also everything. It's the difference between continuing to propagate damage and beginning, slowly, to interrupt the cycle. So rest now. Let the weight of BoJack's story settle into whatever it means for you. Let sleep come naturally, carrying with it the understanding that being human means being imperfect, that change is possible but never complete, that we're all just trying to make it through without breaking too many things or too many people. The stars are still there, indifferent and beautiful, and tomorrow you'll wake up and make your own choices about what kind of person to be. That's all any of us can do. That's all that's ever asked of us. That's enough. Good night.